Ross, we've met before. I'm Doug Little. I've had some experience over the years growing a space business and exiting. And I'd quite like to pick your brains on your experience now. So you've been in the sector, well, working across many sectors for the last 30 years, across aerospace engineering, capital markets, venture capital, Fortune 100 transformation programs, I believe. You've seen what works across multiple sectors and in different countries. And what surprised you most when you started working with space companies? Because we're quite a strange beast. And I guess sort of as an extra question on top of that, what's the one lesson from other industries, from outside the sector, that you think that space founders most need to hear when it comes to scaling their business?
Yeah, thanks, Doug. It's nice to see you again. Just to say a little bit of context, I've worked in a number of different industries, and it's kind of full circle for me back into the space industry, having started off studying aerospace engineering. And of course, the world has changed over that time. We've seen what's happened in financial markets and in technology markets. We've done a lot of work with startups, a lot of work with investors. So we've definitely had quite a wide perspective of what good looks like and maybe what not so good looks like. And in particular, we've spent a lot of time with UK and Scottish companies as well, and advisors. I've done a lot of advisement work with them. And there's definitely things that I think UK companies could do a lot better. And, again, drawing from these other, areas that you see, different markets in the US and across the world and across different ecosystems in the world. I think coming back into the space sector, generally speaking, I think space tech founders are quite like normal tech founders, in the fact that they're very, very invested in their technology and their innovations, and that they're very, very technically focused. And I think the common thing that's missing is a focus on commerciality. In other words, getting customers. And I think in particular with space, I think there's been even more of a tendency than even the normal tech sector to depend on government grants and to depend on government programs. I think that's fine for space, given the fact that there's a dual use component and serving the kind of national interests. I think that makes a lot of sense. But I think the attitude hasn't been as much about government as a customer as it has been like as almost like gap funding. And I think I was particularly, my eyes really got opened when I stepped into the space sector. We need to do a lot of work to help people think about the space sector. Generally, it's a global market, and you need to be able to speak to, sell to, and raise money from people from across the world. So I would say, kind of the second part of your question about kind of what's the one thing you would take from other sectors, is actually I would take it from other markets, would be that focus on customer first, and not just getting the customer, but how do you support the customer? How do you build a customer relationship in a meaningful way that you have like a sustainable and potentially repeatable, customer base?
Fantastic. I agree. I think that mirrors my experience, and when I've worked with other successful founders, what you've said really hits the nail on the head. The ones that engage properly with the customers and are looking to what the customers need, those are the businesses that thrive.
Yeah, and I do think there's a little bit of a cultural aspect of this. There's a little bit of a risk averseness, that being a Scot and there's a bunch of us all being from Britain, we understand this kind of slight hesitancy to put yourself out there, but all the other companies in the world are putting themselves out there, and we need to learn how to do that.
Absolutely. Sort of jumping sideways a bit for the next question, looking at the hiring of the key roles into the business, as you say, you've often started with a fairly tech-focused business and a bunch of founders who are very focused on the technology. You mentioned earlier that bringing in an experienced CFO and COO is really, really important, especially as you're getting towards Series B.
Yeah.
At what revenue level or stage should founders start, seriously recruiting these senior roles? And what's the biggest mistake you see when they wait too long?
Yeah, it's a tough question because it really depends on your business, right? It depends on where you are in your revenues, in the maturity of your product, where you are in going to market. You know, things get complicated once you start having multiple customers and once you're supporting customers over a long period of time, and particularly if those customers are abroad, around the world. You've got to be thinking about the implications of running a global business relatively early. So the minute you have some international customers or potentially something, you need answers to all kinds of things. It's not just scaling the business and having the talent or sales or business development people around the world. You've got to be thinking about tax, legal things, so incorporation around the world. If you're coming to America, are you going to be incorporated in America? What are the tax implications of that? You've got to be thinking about ITAR, and there's both space and non-space regulatory, technology and IP related things. So the minute you're kind of stepping out your border and you're talking with real customers, you have to have that experience in-house. Probably for most people, that probably starts kind of towards Series A. But again, it depends where you are in your investment cycle and your revenue cycle. But I will say, the minute you have one customer, the minute you have two customers, you really need to have your internal organization working well and thinking about, again, not just the acquisition of customer revenue, but the ongoing support of that customer and that customer engagement. I'll tell you for a fact, I've had startups, I've sold startup revenue into the US, into enterprises. And yes, you've got a long sales cycle for an enterprise kind of B2B business. But the question in America is, how are you going to support me? And you've got to have all your ducks in a row for that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, again, mirrors my experience. As soon as you get a serious CFO and a serious COO engaged in the business, it's transformational. And you can start to answer those questions from investors, and you can start to give your customers what they really need. And as you say, you can anticipate a lot of the issues that you were flagging there around dealing internationally. Sort of coming on from that, when you're talking to a Series B investor, what do they actually care about? If you're going to try and pick some metrics, they're going to say, okay, so what's your burn multiple? What's your EBIT? What's your conversion rates? All the kinds of things that are, an investor wants to be able to look at to track the health of a business. Which ones would you pick? What's your top three?
Okay. So I think in space, this is a tough one again, and I'll tell you why. Because you've got to look at the difference between upstream, midstream, and downstream segments. So we'll just take the easier one first, which is downstream. So a lot of downstream businesses, very data driven, right? They're almost like the analogy is to kind of like, what VC have been investing in, SaaS businesses over the last 10, 15 years, right? And those are easy ones. So you may have heard of a thing called the Rule of 40. And so basic for those that don't know that, the idea is you look at your revenue growth as a percentage, and you look at your profitability as percentage, and you put the two things together, and you should get a number that's beyond 40. And the reason that's an interesting thing for software and data related companies is that it allows you to trade the two things off. So are you very revenue growth focused, or are you profitability focused? And when markets crash, you see this correction in the investment market where there's a drive towards quality, there's a drive towards profitability versus just pure growth, right? And you've seen these hyper scaling companies, it's all about the growth. And look at Amazon, right? How long did it take before it was really profitable, but it was making a lot of money in the meantime. So that analogy for the downstream Rule of 40 tells you revenue growth, so it's sustainable, relatable, repeatable growth, I should say. It's about profitability, so it's net margin, EBITDA, whichever metric you want to use, and definitely about pipeline. What is your future pipeline? What's the quality of your pipeline? What's the commercial validation in the market that this isn't just a one-off deal, that you can actually scale this thing? So for downstream, I would say it is the revenue growth and profitability, kind of Rule of 40, plus quality of pipeline. Upstream is a different kettle of fish altogether. You've got lots of hardware, there's long development cycles, you've got to deal with, technology level, maturities and whatnot. And so you can't use the same analogy there. You absolutely need to be able to demonstrate revenue growth. Is there a product market fit? Up 100%. And then I would throw the pipeline bit back in again. What is your future growth and market validation? It's less actually about profitability in the early days. It's actually probably more about cash. Do you have the cash to be able to get through that maturing exercise and get your first few customers? So that's the tweak I would probably make for more upstream type companies.
Okay, very interesting. And anything on midstream?
It's a hybrid. I mean, it's probably a hybrid. I mean, given the fact that midstream do have hardware in there, it's probably closer to the upstream model more than anything.
Cool. And I think in your talk earlier, you were emphasizing getting reference calls and customer testimonials. I know that, we're very British. People get very awkward about asking customers for references or persuading them to come along and meet the investors. Any advice you've got for how you might want to approach your customers, get them to talk, get them to provide written testimonies, get them to turn up with you to meet the investor, is the ideal.
Yeah, I mean, that's a tough one, that last one, isn't it? Especially if your customers are British as well. That's probably even harder, right? I think there's a few things to say about that. I think first and foremost is that you've got to think as a customer relationship as being less transactional and more an actual relationship. If you've built trust and you've partnered, I know it sounds kind of like a little cheesy to say you partner with your customers, but if you've actually built a relationship with your customer, there's no real reason why you shouldn't feel confident in asking for a reference. Now, that reference could be a direct quote. You could ask them to go on video. Yeah, sure, maybe some people are not quite so into that. But if they like you and they've built a relationship with you, you should at least be able to feel confident even getting an indirect quote. Maybe, for example, you write the quote for them, maybe, and they can review it if they either don't have the time or want to deal with that, or offer to work with maybe their marketing department on something that would match whatever their brand needs are, whatever their strategy is. You can also do other things. You can do anonymized case studies. There's an indirect route which you could work with suppliers and other partners around it, and allude to the customer and what the customer got out of the relationship. Again, making sure the customer kind of approves what you're doing. And you've got to be explicit, you've got to be upfront, but don't be afraid to ask. If you've got a good relationship with a customer, it is reasonable to ask.
Yeah, totally agree. And sort of final question for you. Proving you're ready to scale, what's the clearest sign you look for that tells you, you've got a company here that isn't just, it's got lucky, it's had some early wins, but is actually ready to take that next step, has something repeatable and scalable about it. What separates the two, and what would you look for? What are your signs?
So this might come as a bit of a surprise. The first thing is actually cultural readiness. In other words, how, in the venture world, there's this adage, you bet on the jockey, not on the horse. I like to say you bet on the jockey, but you check the horse out as well, right? And what that really means is you're making sure that the organization is a well-formed, well-functional organization. It's got all the right markers of an innovative company, a collaborative company. There's a thing that we do in our business called cultural entropy, which is like a measure of like how messed up the culture is, or is the leadership aligned with the organization and vice versa. And I've seen companies where, the leadership are all good chat, they all seem like good people, but when you talk to the organization, it's maybe not the best culture in the world. I've seen the opposite, of course, as well. So I actually do look at the cultural readiness, and investors are generally pretty good at looking at both the founder, which is often the jockey, and the leadership team around it. So that's cultural. I would say the next thing is definitely a commercial kind of rhythm. So what are the systems you have in place to create and build, a high quality pipeline? How are you feeding that pipeline? Are you feeding the pipeline? What does it look like as you kind of move through that pipeline, and what's your conversion rates look like? What have you done to kind of systematize that to some degree? and what relationships and partnerships have you built? I mean, there's very few, really very few companies. There's a couple of primes you could all think of where that one company can maybe do it all. Most companies need partners and suppliers and whatnot. And so what does that ecosystem look like? And then the third thing is the obvious one, which is the technical maturity. And, you know, on the upstream side, you know, what have you done with testing? You know, you're dealing with, you know, complex systems, complex materials, extreme engineering, all the usual stuff there. But even, you know, on the downstream side, there's a lot of things that people forget about. You know, I've got probably a lot more experience in the software side than in the hardware side. The thing that people often don't think about is what we call non-functional requirements, meaning your software might be nice, the data might tell us a story, you might have a nice service offering, but is it really ready to scale? Really ready to scale? And I think if you think about cultural, the commercial, and technical maturity, those, if you're ticking those boxes, you're probably in pretty good shape.
Fantastic. Well, thanks a lot, Ross. Really appreciated a chance to talk to you after your excellent presentation earlier. So thank you very much. Thanks for your time.
All right. Cheers, Doug. Good seeing you again.
Cheers. Bye.